Hi, everybody, and welcome to this first ever interview here on the YouTube channel, St. Thomas Aquinas for Everyone. I'm Dave Palmer. And up until now, I have basically been doing a lot of teaching about one book, St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologia, and a couple of departures from that. And I sometimes say I'm a one-trick pony. I know a lot about St. Thomas Aquinas. I teach St. Thomas Aquinas, and I love it. I love him. But I also have a broader interest in the history of philosophy, and so I decided to rent this little studio, which is kind of cool. And I'm going to be bringing in different experts in philosophy to talk about different philosophers and different ways that people have thought over the history of mankind. And so I hope you enjoy this. And I'm delighted. When I first thought of this, the first person that came to my mind is a gentleman by the name of Joe Provenzano, because he had come to our radio studio recently and really impressed me with his knowledge and breadth of philosophy. And he wrote a book called Conscious Energy. And the first half of it is an overview of all the different philosophers and the different branches of philosophy. And I thought, boy, this is my guy. And so Joe is here, and his wife is actually here. Linda is here in studio with us. We're not going to drag her on camera. I promise that. But I also want to thank my daughter, Maura. She is running the board and kind of controlling things, and so it's great to have her and dad and daughter working together like this. So, Joe, thanks for coming in, being the guinea pig for this first interview about philosophy.
I'll give it my best shot.
Yeah,
We'll see
yeah.
what
So how did the philosophy bug, so to speak, get into you? When did you start being interested in this?
I was a dual math and physics major at University of St. Thomas, ironically, and
Houston?
Houston,
Yeah, okay.
yes. And we had them in the good old days. You had to minor in philosophy and theology, whatever you majored in.
You had to.
And I wasn't real interested in the philosophy because
Yeah.
it seemed like I was working harder on the weekends than the philosophers were.
Okay.
But anyway, after a while, I began to get really interested in it, and I mean really interested in it. Not enough to change majors or anything, because physics is my thing. But when I got out, I began to go back to the philosophy, and one of the things that fascinated me the most is how can all these philosophers be great when they're telling you everything completely different? And to me, that almost made no sense, because it doesn't work that way in science.
Yeah.
So that was one thing that puzzled me. But also, I really wanted to get answers to what I call the two big questions, which is, what is it all about? Which is what's driving evolution? What's the fundamental thing about the universe? Something's got to be there.
Yeah.
And the other one was, how should we live our lives? Now, I know you can get those from custom, you can get them from your parents, or you can get them from your religion. But I wanted to, can you derive it from what we know?
Yeah.
So I started reading the philosophers one by one. And that's ultimately we got to where we are.
Did you go
today.
sequentially, like chronologically, and do
Pretty
the
much,
Greeks, and then what was your methodology?
A little bit of that, but a little bit all over the place, because certain ones of them, like Kant and St. Thomas, and I went after some big ones, and then I filled it in. It was kind of a patchwork before I got it all done.
Yeah.
It wasn't any systematical approach, because I was looking for an answer. I wasn't trying to do a history of philosophy, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
It was only after I saw Teilhard and saw his ideas that I decided to do that.
And he's the one that you really like a lot. And we're going to do a full interview at some point just about him, because I don't really have any familiarity with him at all. And that's one of the things I want to do in these interviews is find somebody, like philosophy PhDs at University of Dallas or SMU, and find out what they want to talk about, and then just pick their brains and learn and let the audience out there learn as well. Now, in this particular one, I said, hey, let's just do an introduction to philosophy. And then the second one we're going to do will be about the different, you say branches, you literally have created a kind of a tree.
Only I could make sense
with branches, which I think is very helpful. Yeah. So let's, most basic question, what is philosophy? How would you define it? I know it's the love of wisdom.
It's the love of wisdom, and I see it as I mentioned the two big questions a minute ago. What is it all about? Is there something fundamental about the universe that we can really see and understand? What's driving the evolutionary process, for example? And then the second question is, given that, how are we a part of that? It seemed to me like lasting happiness would come when you aligned yourself with how we are. We know about evolution. We know we evolved. That's something that St. Thomas and the earliers didn't have.
Yeah. A lot of people, when I talk about St. Thomas Aquinas, they'll say, was he a philosopher or was he a theologian? And I'll say he's both. And they'll say, well, what's the difference? And I know my answer to that, but what's the difference between philosophy and theology in your estimation?
Philosophy is answers to those two questions based on what we know, not using Scripture.
Yeah.
It's just pure reason and our experience and the results we have. And you develop a philosophy of the way things are. Theology is when you take what we have from Scripture, God, but there's, they don't give you everything in Scripture. We have holes and curiosities and things. So the idea is a theologian will take some philosophy that he likes. Most typically it's been in traditionally St. Thomas, but it could be any philosopher that gives you answers. You take that philosophy, you take what you know from Scripture, and you put them together.
Now, I'm Catholic, you're Catholic. From a Catholic perspective, it's not only Scripture, but it would be divine, tradition as well.
Tradition and doctrine,
yeah, so if the
sure,
church says,
all of it. I say Scripture, I mean
right.
the
Anything,
much broader. No, any doctrine especially.
Okay,
yeah.
What Thomas would call divine law.
Absolutely.
But it surpasses the grasp of human reason, right? By its very nature, would you say that's right?
Absolutely. And St. Thomas felt that you could get to truth with philosophy, but you couldn't get to everything. There's some things you could never know there are three gods, three persons in one God. You might be able to conclude there's a God, but you wouldn't be able to conclude that there's three.
Yeah, you have to accept that on faith.
Well, that and that's doctrine. So you're putting it all together to try to. So that's what you do with philosophy.
And of course, the two could go in harmony, or they can butt heads, depending on what philosopher you're talking about, right?
Well, some philosophers say there are no answers. The universe is absurd. There's no God. You can't even ask the questions.
Yeah, and that's when we
can't use that to do much theology.
When we start getting into individual philosophers, maybe in the second interview or beyond, some of them totally discard theology and only believe in reason. I'm thinking about a guy like Auguste Comte,
Absolutely.
where and then positivism, right?
Yes.
Where it's all science. It's I just throw all that other stuff out. And some people would be the exact opposite, like only what we have faith in, But
those are all branches of the tree.
Yeah, right.
If we have time.
See, I'm jumping into the second interview already, aren't I?
Right.
Okay, let me.
We could cover that with an overview, perhaps.
Yeah, let's. We'll save that for the second one. So I'm getting so excited about that one that I'm jumping into that one already. But when it comes to philosophy, there's certain terminology that philosophers use that I think your average person may scratch their head and trying to figure out, what it all means. So let me throw out a couple of terms to you, maybe more than a couple, and kind of explain what it means. Okay, well, metaphysics. You hear that term a lot.
Metaphysics is really comes from Aristotle through St. Thomas and a lot of the other medieval theologians. They're on what I call the reason branch. Everyone on that branch shares the idea that the universe is reasonable. They're not saying reason's necessarily the most fundamental aspect, but the universe is reasonable. And if you study it, you should be able to get some answers. Well, the metaphysicians, they didn't have modern science. What they would do is they would start, I guess, probably with Plato. And they would develop concepts and ideas about reality, the nature of reality. And then from those few basic concepts, you can move logic, you can get information in two directions. You can reason up. You might conclude, well, there's a reason for everything, or everything depends on existence, so there must be a God.
Mm-hmm.
So you can reason up to a God and things like that. Or you might say, well, we're part of this, so we need to act a certain way. We shouldn't murder people. You could reason about things like that.
Yeah.
That's what I call reasoning up. That's what you could do with metaphysics. The other thing you can, and that's, I think, still a valid thing. The other thing that they did with metaphysics that ultimately caused all the blowback from science is the metaphysicians would reason down. They would say, well, the heavenly objects are so perfectly out there, they must move in circles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They would conclude things about the physical world based on those
making
principles.
Assumptions that
right. That's what got the whole metaphysics. That's what got metaphysics into trouble. So when science came along and says, no, they don't move in circles. The Earth, is not at the center, and all these things. The tendency was to throw out metaphysics.
Yeah,
Okay?
yeah.
Thomas Aquinas with it. But they missed that other side of metaphysics that no one ever talks about, that it could be valid to reason up from
Yeah,
that.
yeah, right.
It's just that in this universe, the particulars of matter, science works better.
Yeah. Would Copernicus be an example of the top to bottom flying in the face of metaphysics, or the whole?
Well, Galileo was the one that he felt. In Galileo's day, there was only three ways you could get to knowledge. Really, you could do this metaphysics, or you could. Let's see. There's a couple of other ways that they used to do it. You could get scripture, or you could talk to someone who knew scripture or who knew metaphysics, and then they could learn it people. So those were the three ways. He said, no, there's a fourth way. You go out and take some measurements and come up with some mathematical formulas and make predictions, and if you're right, you get the next result. He thought that should be the fourth way and separate. Well, we now think that he was onto something, but there were some initial issues with the church. The problem is, after he was unsuccessful in establishing both, science began to gobble up the metaphysics and God and everything else with it.
Yeah.
And that's part of the history of philosophy. So he believed in both. His thing was that, that Scripture tells you how the heavens, how to go to heaven, but science tells you how the heavens move, the physics of it.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, but that didn't hold up because, as you already mentioned Comte and some of these others. We can talk later about how they just began to gobble up everything. If you can't verify it, it doesn't exist.
Yeah, yeah.
No God, no soul, no nothing.
Boy, I asked you about metaphysics, and then I brought you in a whole lot of different directions.
Well,
and that's
key.
good. See, that's what metaphysics does, is it gets us our minds working. Let me go on to another term. Like ontology is the study of being, right?
Yes.
So being would be just existence. Is that right?
It's what exists.
What exists. Okay.
Yeah,
So anytime somebody talks about the ontology, the ontological argument, that has to do with being.
Being
okay.
is stuff that exists.
Okay. Being in existence would be
the verb would be
right?
to exist.
Yeah, yeah.
I can think of a pink giraffe, but it doesn't exist.
Right.
It has no being.
Yeah.
It has maybe mental being, but not actual being.
Yeah.
So that's what being is.
Okay. Form and matter. I think people understand matter. The matter of this book are the pages and the ink. The form, that's something that I think throws people a little bit. What's form?
Well, if you notice that electrons, for example, they all behave the same way. How do they know how to do that?
Yeah.
There's obviously something internal to them which tells them what to do. And same with people. We have something in us that we are what we are. Things are different, not just composite things like a table, but individual things. That inner thing is what the form was.
Yeah.
That's what Aristotle and Aquinas tried to describe as the form. It becomes the soul with humans, and it's a soul, but not a self-conscious soul in animals. It's animating. Today's terms we would call it non-physical, but real.
Yeah, yeah. But people get confused.
The matter is just the stuff.
Yeah, but people get confused because you think like the form of the pen, they think it's the shape. It's not necessarily. We're not talking about shape. We're talking about what something is.
What it is. Yeah. See, the pen is really a composite of a bunch of things.
Are form and essence the same thing?
Similar. Essence is what the thing really is, and it's related to its form. The form is more how does it let it function, but the essence is what it really is.
All right, yeah.
And of course, all of those are metaphysical terms which were denied by the later philosophers, existentialism and so forth.
We can't get those philosophers to get along, can we?
No, that was one of the things.
It'd be nice to get them all in the same room, and just let them have it out. But they all lived at different times, and spread out.
And if this one's right, that one's wrong.
Yeah,
none of them agreed.
But
that's how the different branches started.
Yeah.
When a certain branch would reach the end, and they would say, well, there's no more place to go. We'll go another direction.
Because there have been some philosophers that have said basically we've done everything we can do. Didn't Wittgenstein say that? Like that's the end
Oh
of
yeah,
philosophy?
yeah,
or,
yeah.
and I think the Catholic Church probably said, well, Thomas got it right, and I think not that they ever said we're done with philosophy, but there tends to be a certain sense like I think we got it all worked out, right?
Right.
Yeah, and it never seems to be the case because the next person comes along.
I think Teilhard's ideas give us a new philosophy. The
Yeah.
conscious energy is a philosophy.
Yeah.
Ultimately, we'll get to that.
Let me give you two more terms. I think I got them all here. No, I didn't get them all, but the ones that I wanted to ask you about: teleology. A teleological telos has to do with the end, right?
Yeah, it means there's a purpose.
Yeah.
The scientists would deny that. The more religious people would say, sure, there is.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of arguments about the universe and it's whether it has a purpose or not. And
Yeah.
Does it have a, So that's obviously another one of these things in contention.
Right.
Unfortunately, philosophy's given up on all that stuff.
Given up on purpose?
Yeah, there's no
really?
purpose to nature. It's absurd. It just is.
The modern trends in philosophy.
I'm talking about the modern stuff.
But Aquinas certainly believed in it.
Aquinas.
Aristotle, yeah.
Absolutely.
So that would be a good way of dividing philosophers according to whether or not they believe there's any purpose. Whereas somebody like, and again, here I go, I'm getting into individual ones, but somebody like the nihilists or Sartre, they would just believe like there's no purpose. Existentialists.
Yeah, in fact, interesting that you mention it. The word existentialism means there is no essence.
Yeah.
You make choices, and your choices. Now, see, there's always a piece of truth in every one of these philosophers. That's part of the problem.
Yeah, that's the problem.
Because it is true that your choices help define what you are. But see, for the real existentialists like Sartre, that was the complete thing. There was nothing there to begin with. There's no image of God that needs to act a certain way. You are a blank canvas.
Yeah.
And the universe is absurd. Now go make some choices and you'll create your own essence.
Yeah.
But we're getting ahead.
It's problematic, isn't it?
It's very problematic.
All right. So I think those are the only other one I want to ask you about is epistemology. That I think cuts to the very nature of philosophy because it has to do with the study of knowledge, right?
Yeah, how we know.
Yeah.
Sense experience.
And we can't even agree on that. I mean, philosophers don't agree on it.
Oh, absolutely not. In fact, that came later after the reason branch. When the reason branch had kind of reached its limit, they began to study, well, we can't really study what there is until we study how we know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Descartes started that. He was the first to focus on the mind.
Yeah.
He said he was a mathematician. He wanted something certain. So he said, I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, and what he meant by that was if he's thinking, he has to exist. So, I mean, I'll buy that.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, he went on to think, well, if that's the case, then there must be a God because I couldn't be tricking myself like this. He drew all kinds of nice things. The conclusions are good, but they don't really follow from I think, therefore I am. That's the problem.
Yeah, yeah. And so he would have been a rationalist.
Yes.
Let's.
He's on the reason tree.
So, the history of philosophy. Did philosophy begin with the pre-Socratics in Greece? At least as far as the history we know of.
Yes. You could make a claim that Buddha and some of those were philosophers, and we could talk about them. I didn't do a lot about the Eastern, but really, as we know it, the idea that you're going to figure out something and make it happen started with, I guess, probably Thales. He was the first Greek, before Plato. And we can talk about him because he's pretty simple. He just felt like there had to be something out there. This multiplicity we see, there's got to be an underlying substance that's in everything and part of everything. And he thought it was water, which isn't. It sounds kind of funny at first, but, you wake up in the morning, there's dew on the plants, and, you things, we have liquid in us, which is red, but it's water with stuff in it. And so he thought that there was an underlying substance. You can't get much morality out of that, or you can't really answer the second big question. But he started the process that has never stopped. It's gotten pessimistic, but saying there's no answer to those questions is a philosophy.
Yeah, at least he came up with something.
He
got people
started.
thinking, right?
He got it started.
Yeah. And interesting. So you have spent decades and decades and decades pondering over all these things, and then you ended up writing a couple of books. And not going to get too much into it, but Conscious Energy is the book that
Yeah.
you wrote, and we're going to talk about this tree and the branches in the next interview. But what was kind of I guess, the way your mind kind of sifted through all these different philosophers? Which ones did you think had, influenced you to the point where you've kind of settled on a particular philosophy that you think ultimately is right?
Yes, yes, I have. And here's what happened. I'll try to make it brief. I went through all these guys, and it was first thing that was driving me nuts is how can they be so opposite and they're all great philosophers?
Mm-hmm.
That's when I had to really pin down, well, what is philosophy? And I realized every one of these philosophers, whether they told you that or so explicitly or not, they had some really fundamental insight into reality.
Yeah.
That was drove everything else. So if they're going to be a good philosopher, they have to have something, and it has to be reasonable. Like the existentialist free will, that's important.
Mm-hmm.
Well, to them, will drove everything. Well,
Yeah.
you can develop a whole philosophy, and they did. And then there were others and different ones. So I realized that was one thing. But the other thing I realized is that carried you to a conclusion. So a great philosopher has a really good insight to something that's pretty fundamental, maybe not the most, but pretty fundamental, and his logic is airtight. That makes them good. Some of them aren't airtight. They're not. I don't think they're as good philosophers, but the ones that are airtight. So that's what I looked for, and I decided that the only way you can judge your philosophy is the insight reasonable? Are they logical in their path? And does it lead you somewhere that you want to be, that
Mhm.
makes sense? If they end up telling you the universe is absurd, or for example, Nietzsche's a perfect example. Self-preservation is certainly very vital to us. We wouldn't survive without it. We have it. It is very important. You make that the most, you get the will to power. Pretty soon, might makes right. You end up with something like Hitler. And so I just concluded his insight was reasonable, his logic was reasonable, but I don't like where it ended up. I can't
Mhm.
believe that's what's going on. So I figured he's wrong for that reason. So that's the key, finding that insight. Well, after looking at all these philosophers, Teilhard's insight is the one that
Give
made
the full name.
most.
Tate. What's his full name?
Pierre Teilhard de Chardin.
Okay.
Most people that,
Frenchman.
oh yeah,
I was going to say that
Yeah,
sounds
yeah.
like a French name.
yeah,
When did he live?
he died in same year as Einstein, 1955. He
Okay,
died. So he
okay.
saw modern science.
Yeah. Was he a religious person?
He was a Jesuit priest,
Okay.
a paleontologist, scientist. He was a mystic. He was everything under the sun. He was a philosopher, but he probably wouldn't admit it. Turn over in his grave if I said that. But
Really? Why wouldn't he want
well,
to be a philosopher?
he was just not interested in separating disciplines.
Yeah.
He kind of made everybody
Philosophy
aggravated.
gets a bad name sometimes, doesn't
Well,
it?
he kind
People don't
of
want.
he was too mystical for the scientists. He
Yeah.
was too scientific for the religious people. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
He was all over the map, but he had this vision, and he saw the vision as striving from the very beginning to produce increasing complex entities, but not just any kind of complexity, a complexity that leads to consciousness. And he saw that as the driving force. It's kind of the opposite of the second law.
Is
of
it like an
thermodynamics.
evolutionary kind of thing?
Oh, absolutely.
Like,
Evolution.
Was he in line with the church, or did the church condemn him, or
They didn't condemn him, but they had some issues. with
Because
him.
it sounds like a spiritual evolution. Is that what it is? Rather than like Darwin would have taled about a more physical.
Darwin would have talked more about survival of the fittest. He would have talked more about an increasing consciousness and complexity. So
Okay.
we ended up in human beings.
Yeah.
So the next step would be for us to work together and proceed. The church had some issues with him over original sin and Adam and Eve because he saw a more natural evolution.
Yeah.
It was God's creative process.
Right.
But he's making kind of a comeback.
Is he well known?
He's
I mean,
very well
So anybody studying philosophy would know about him. He's
Yeah, but for years he was kind of looked down upon, and now he's kind of coming back. I focused on that insight.
yeah.
And he had one other insight of change of state, which is something that a lot of people think of the spiritual and the physical are completely separate entities, like water and ice. But water and ice aren't really separate entities.
Yeah.
You get it cold enough, it freezes, so they change of state.
Yeah.
He saw more of energy evolving and changing state, and then you can get to what you would call spiritual. It's just a higher state of the. That's
Now,
what I think
did he
energy is.
did he believe that the ultimate state was going to be union with God?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so there was a heaven, there's beatitude.
Everything, like I said, an issue with maybe angels, whether God created angels or not, or He just created this way, and an issue with was there really a Garden of Eden type Adam?
Okay. Okay.
Or is this just God's
Was he
creative
would
process?
he have been considered a Thomist? Or did he like
No.
Aquinas? No.
No,
Okay.
no, he was more.
Who would have been his biggest influences? Like a philosopher that he leaned on heavily. Can you think of anybody?
Like I say, he wasn't really a philosopher.
He didn't want to be a philosopher.
He didn't
Yeah,
really
okay.
identify with philosophy.
Yeah. Paleontologist, you said?
Yes.
Yeah.
He saw what he saw, and he didn't try to distinguish his philosophy from his theology, from his mysticism. He just gave you what his ideas.
All right. Is everybody a philosopher deep down? We all are, aren't we? If we have reason, we can think. We ask those two questions you were talking about earlier.
If we can tie it to one thing, but if you're just one of these bag of opinion guys, you ask me about, something, and I'll tell you, well, since I like this, I like it here, but I'll give you the opposite logic because I want this over here. That's
Yeah.
not a philosopher,
Yeah.
even though he might be sharp. He's got to be able to have a vision of reality. I'm not saying he has to develop it and be a original philosopher. But like if you like St. Thomas, you think he had a good vision of reality and you see things in a coherent whole, then you're a philosopher.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anybody that can put it together like that.
Yeah. I like to think of myself as a philosopher.
Well, you are.
Not the brightest one in the world, but I enjoy it very much. And so this is a good conversation. I think this is a good introduction. We got a little bit into what you're writing about. You're updating your book. Was it some new revelation, or what's the purpose behind that?
The updating of the book is, when I wrote that book something like 30 years ago almost, the philosophy is in the state that it's in. It's still in that state today. I wasn't as worried about it then because average people weren't listening to the philosophers.
Yeah.
They were going to church. They were, they believed in and just, what's happened in the last 30 years, right? We've lost that.
Yeah.
And so somehow that pessimism from the philosophy, even though nobody sits back and says, I accept the philosophy of so-and-so, they don't do that.
Yeah.
No one philosopher, Marx has gotten, his political ideas have gotten there, but his underlying philosophy, people don't run around and say, I like his underlying.
Yeah.
Because it's kind of weird, it's about production. But I kind of wanted to update it to point out to people that I missed that in the first book.
Yeah.
I didn't catch that I didn't expect that to happen.
Yeah.
And I think we need to combat that. Of course, there are some people combating it politically. I'm not into the politics, but I'm trying to combat it philosophically and with my other book through science and theology.
Yeah, very good. Joe Provenzano, thank you very much. Again, the book is called Conscious Energy. The other one he referred to as the fallen angel model. That'll be a whole different conversation, right?
We could do that sometime, too.
All right. This has been interview number 1 here on the website. Hopefully you enjoyed that. I'm about to do another interview with Joe where we talk about the different branches of philosophy and some of the main players. I'm just going to kind of throw out some names to them. Some of them we talked about during this interview, but we're going to go a little bit deeper in the second interview. Thank you very much for watching. God bless you.